It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Walker here today. Dr. Walker is a senior lecturer at the School of Economics at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. We're really delighted that she has agreed to get up early so she can have part of her day overlap with ours and present in our seminar this afternoon. Sarah is a really very talented emerging scholar in the fields of development economics, environmental economics, economic history. Sort of her work centers on a lot of really interesting questions related to institutions, culture, and also sort of development in the environment. Sarah's work has won sort of several honors and awards. So in 2020, the Paul Burke Award for Early Career Research from the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. She's also a winner of the Discovery Early Career Research Award from the Australian Research Council. And today she's going to be sharing some of her really fascinating work with us that she's done on refugee communities in Kenya. I will pass it over to Sarah for her talk. She's allowed interruptions throughout sort of an econ style talk. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand or use the chat feature. If you use the chat feature, I will sort of find a nice time to interject and ask the questions. That way she doesn't have to monitor the chat herself. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Sarah for the talk.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you so much to the center for inviting me. This is a real pleasure. And I'm excited to share this work with you. This is actually kind of an older project at this point. This is, first of all, joint work with Jennifer Alex Garcia, who is an economist at Oregon State University, and incidentally is also the former PhD advisor to myself and to Emily. So we share a very common bond there. And it's also joint work with Anne Bartlett, who's a sociologist at University of New South Wales here in Sydney. So it's truly an interdisciplinary set of work, and I'm delighted to share this with an interdisciplinary audience. So, we actually collected the data for this project in 2015, and I'm going to present today to you two papers actually that have already been published. So one in 2018 and one in 2019, which is a little bit awkward, I must say, for an economist, because we're really used to presenting work in progress and sort of getting feedback there. But nonetheless, I think it's important work, and I hope you do as well. And I'm still interested, obviously, in your comments and having a discussion around this. So thanks for that. So the motivation for this work is obviously, it's no secret to the people in this room that the numbers of forcibly displaced people are at an all-time high. So when you look at the most recent data coming out from UNHCR in 2022, this stands at 103 million displaced people currently, 32.5 million of whom are refugees. And actually, as I was preparing for this seminar, I went back to these slides that I made a few years ago when it was still a work in progress. And at that time, the data from UNHCR in 2016 was 65 million displaced people and about 22.5 million refugees. So you can see even in these 6 years, the numbers have skyrocketed, and they're only going to continue to rise as people flee affected regions and seek asylum internationally. Something that's that I think we also know about the situation with refugees is that many refugees are living in permanent settlements. So they're living in camps. The best data that I could come across is still from 2015 when we were collecting our data. So about 41% of refugees live in camps that have been in place for over 5 years. So these are long-term, protracted situations. And there are 7 settlements worldwide with populations over 80,000 people. So these are like cities. These are small cities, sometimes large cities, depending on which camp you're looking at. So these camps are, the largest camp is in Bangladesh with over 700,000 refugees living there. We're going to look at a camp in Kenya. Kenya has a couple of very large camps with populations over 180,000 people. Other places include Jordan, Uganda, and Sudan. So, one of the main features of the refugee situation that I like to highlight is that, most refugees, 83% of refugees are actually living in low or middle income countries. And, in high income countries like the US or Australia, where I'm living, or especially in Europe, a lot of the debate in policy is coming around, is focused on, well, how is this impacting us in high income countries? But one thing I like to highlight is that the majority of refugees are living in low and middle income countries that already are not in the best position to host refugees financially, but nonetheless, they do. The other statistic I'd like to highlight is that a large percentage, 69% of refugees, come from just 5 countries. So as we know, there's ongoing crises in Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, which is only increasing. We're going to focus on the camp, a particular camp in Kenya, which is largely home to South Sudanese refugees who've been there for now over 30 years. So the first question we asked with this project was, how do refugee camps impact host communities? There's a large debate around hosting displaced people. It's a very heated debate, but especially at the time we were conducting this work, the empirical evidence was very sparse. I think in recent years, there's been a large contribution to the literature, and I think people in the room probably know more about the more recent work than I do, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. But it's kind of an empirical question: how do refugee camps impact host communities? And this is really important for policymaking because, especially at the time we were conducting our field work, the Kenyan government was on the verge of shutting down camps, and it was important to understand what are the impacts of these camps before we throw the baby out with the bathwater. Some of these concerns are not misplaced. There's fear of labor market competition, but there's also potential benefits from hosting refugees, including stimulating demand, filling labor market gaps, innovation, and exchange of knowledge. So we explore a specific case of long-run encampment in a place called Kakuma, Kenya, which is in the northwestern region of Kenya on the border of South Sudan. And this camp has been in existence since 1992. And we will explore, not only will we look at sort of the average of economic impacts, so that's also important to highlight. There's a lot of other impacts that are relevant for policy, but as primarily an economist, what we're studying here are the economic impacts. And then we want to explore relevant channels, if we do find any impacts. The second question we asked was, well, how are refugees surviving? So largely, in most refugee camps, countries are practicing a policy of what they call enclosure. So refugees can't really leave the camp. They can't work outside of the camps, which means they have to live off predominantly of food aid or internal camp economy. So one of the things I'll show you today is that there's a flourishing economy within the camp itself. Or they live off of remittances from relatives who are either living in the country that was fled or living elsewhere in the world, maybe in higher income countries. And so what happened, this second question sort of just landed in our laps by happenstance. So when we were in the camp in 2015, collecting the data for the first question, there was a sort of what we'd call a natural experiment that occurred where one channel of remittances was completely cut off. And we were able to measure, what happens when this channel is shut down. So you can imagine, that obviously there would be impacts on refugee households that use this form of remittances, but also if there are interlinkages economically between the host and the refugee community, there could also be externalities or flow-on effects to the host community. And so we'll look at that also. So the context of our study takes place in Kenya, which obviously shares a border with some highly impacted regions, refugee sending regions such as South Sudan, Somalia, and now Ethiopia. And we are focusing, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but in the very northwest corner of Kenya on the border of South Sudan is a region called Turkana. And we're looking specifically at a camp basically right about there called Kakuma. So something to know about Turkana is that it's home to the Turkana people. And the Turkana people are a group of semi-nomadic pastoralists who are largely disengaged with a formal economy. And certainly in the early 90s, were disengaged with a formal economy. And they mostly herd cattle for a living. So they'll set up semi-permanent residences where they practice maybe a little bit of horticulture. Mostly women are practicing a little bit of horticulture, and the men predominantly are herding cattle. They'll go out for long periods of time to graze their cattle, and they'll come back, and then maybe they pick up and move to another settlement. Something to note about Turkana is that it is extremely poor and isolated. So this data comes from the 2005 census, and that was the most recent data we had at the time of publication. I just checked the stats from the 2018 census the other day, and not much has changed. So, something to note is that even when Kenya is a low and middle income country itself, but when you compare Turkana to the rest of Kenya, it's even poorer. So 94%, I think now it's around 90% of households living in Turkana are below the poverty line. Household sizes are larger than they are even in other rural parts of Kenya. School attendance is extremely low. That has not changed much in the past almost 20 years. And households rely far less on farming than the rest of Kenyan households. That's largely because the area of Turkana is very arid. It's dry. I showed you the picture. Has a very scrubby set of foliage. The soil is not great. And for one of those reasons, for some of those reasons, households largely rely on cattle herding for a living. So you can see, the average number of cattle, goats, sheep owned by Turkana households is much larger than households in other parts of Kenya. So in the early 90s, a long and protracted conflict in South Sudan intensified, and 7,000 South Sudanese, mostly young boys, walked from South Sudan across into Ethiopia temporarily and over the border into Kenya. And these boys have been referred to as the Lost Boys, and there's a lot that's been written about them. If you haven't read the book, What is the What by Dave Eggers, it's a fantastic story, true story of one of these boys who fled South Sudan and ultimately ended up in the United States. But it gives a really intimate portrayal of what these boys endured in their journey. So in 1991, around 7,000 young boys walked into Kenya and settled actually just over the border in a town called Lokichogio. And by the following year, more and more people had started to come over the border, and the government of Kenya agreed to set up a refugee camp in the town of Kakuma, which at the time had a population of less than 6,000. By the following year, 35,000 people were living in the camp, and essentially overnight, Kakuma became a city. And by 2015, at the time when we were conducting our field work, over 180,000 refugees were living in Kakuma refugee camp, coming mostly from South Sudan, but from other areas as well, including Somalia, the DRC, Ethiopia, and Darfur. And today, Kakuma is one of the longest standing refugee camps and one of the largest in the world. So here's an aerial shot of Kakuma. It is situated between two rivers that are mostly dry, but in the rainy seasons, they tend to flood. And it consists of semi-permanent structures. But, over time, an economy has developed. I mean, it's essentially a city now, and there's flourishing markets. So this is a picture of one of the central markets in the camp. This is Franco's Hotel, which is a delicious Ethiopian restaurant where we would often meet with our team for lunch and debriefings. But there's all kinds of markets and businesses that operate within the camp, restaurants, little shops, tailors. It's really a flourishing economy. And there's a lot of exchange, which not only among the refugees, but also among the host population. So Anne, our colleague, is a sociologist. She's a qualitative researcher. She did a lot of semi-structured interviews with people. And in a lot of these qualitative interviews, it became clear that there's just a very strong link between the host and the refugee economy. So many of the Turkana people use the markets in the camp as their main markets. There's also schools and hospitals that are accessible to both the refugee and the host population within the camp.
Sorry, Sarah, one question. Sure. Are the people in the refugee camp able to go and work outside or to work in general? And if not, what means do they use? What currency do they use at that point in order to get the many, goods and services that have developed inside this camp?
Yeah. So thank you for that question. At first, just to answer quickly, no. So Kakuma Kenya practices a policy of, full encampment. So refugees are not allowed to work outside of the camp, which means that they rely predominantly on the food aid that's given to them by UNHCR, which consists mostly of flour, oil, beans, and rice, which they get, depending on how large their household is. They get once a month, a set amount. But something to note is actually that, and this is specific to I think this is specific to Kakuma. I'm sure it's true in other camps, but I do want to highlight that the refugees that are coming into the camp, relatively speaking, are wealthier than the Turkana people. So they're coming with more human capital. They're also coming with more capital, and they have links to people outside of the camp that send them remittances. And so that's what you'll see us talk about in sort of the second part of the paper. But in the meantime, if they can get enough capital to, for instance, set up a shop, a lot of refugees have created their own businesses and are living off of that if they can, or remittances, or in the worst of circumstances, just the food aid that is given to them. They can also get employed by UNHCR as translators or as teachers or as medical workers to the extent that they have the training. And now, because the camp has been there for so long, there's a generation of people adults who have grown up, who were either born in the camp or moved there at a very young age and, went to school there and are now, essentially living in the camp as if it's their hometown. So when we think about the possible ways in which hosting refugees could affect the local economy, there are a couple of different, the predictions are not clear upfront. So the effects could operate through many different channels. The first is a labor market channel. So one of the primary concerns we hear in higher income countries is what's going to happen when refugees come to our labor markets. Are these going to depress wages? And, as long as the locals are employed in the same market that refugees are trying to get jobs in, this could depress wages. On the other hand, if the NGOs that are setting up these refugee camps demand labor and skills that the local population has, this could increase wages through labor demand. Another way that refugee camps could impact the local economy is through competition with aid-related goods. So to the extent that UNHCR and the WFP are pushing a whole increased supply of goods into the market, if there are producers locally who are also producing these goods, that competition, that's going to depress the price. First of all, the increase in supply will depress the price. If you're a producer, that's going to hurt you. But if you're a consumer, if you're a net consumer, that's going to help you, because now you're paying less for things that you used to pay more for. When we think about non-aid goods, so things that UNHCR and the WFP are not producing, but maybe are produced locally, the increase in demand from the shock in the population will increase the price, so that if you're a net producer of these goods, that will help you because you can sell your goods at a higher price. But if you're a consumer, if you're mostly just consuming these goods, that increase in the price can hurt you. So it's not very clear up front how hosting refugees is going to impact the economy. So we're going to try and tease out, which of these channels is happening and look, at the average effects. So to do this, we combine data from many, many different data sources. So the first thing we look at are, so that we can get a nice long-term view, we take data from nighttime satellites, which are, have been pretty established in the literature as a good proxy for economic activity. And even in a place like Turkana, you can observe nighttime lights, even though it is isolated and rural. You do observe nighttime lights. At first, we were like, maybe we're not going to see anything, but you do. So we have the GPS data points for 648 villages in Turkana, which we then map to the nighttime lights data in each year from 1993 to 2013. And we combine that with data on the refugee population in each year. And so we're going to look essentially at how far your village is from the camp. And over time, as the refugee population increases, how does the economic activity in your village fluctuate? We combine that data also with some data from the Hunger Safety Net program, which was an unconditional cash transfer program that was being rolled out by the government of Kenya at the time. And it's a proxy means tested program. So they surveyed over 140,000 households to get information primarily on consumption to see if they could, if they were eligible for the program. And we have access to that data, so we can, at a snapshot, at least cross-sectionally, we can understand, consumption of these households, again, at distances that are near to the camp and far from the camp. We also combine that with information on livestock prices over time. So there's 5 key livestock markets in Kenya, one of which happens to be located in Turkana. And we can look at how prices of livestock fluctuates in those markets over time as refugees come in to the camp. And then finally, we collect our own data from June to July 2015. We surveyed around 450 Turkana households, so in the host population, and around 170 refugee households. So again, we have another snapshot of cross-sectional data, this time just from within the camp and then around Turkana. So we have 2 empirical strategies that we will use to answer this question. The first is to just look at the nighttime lights as a proxy for economic activity. And we look at whether the effect of the refugee population increasing is stronger for villages closer to the camp compared to far away from the camp. And then we'll corroborate this with our cross-sectional data, both from the HSNP, the cash transfer survey, again, looking at consumption close to the camp versus far away from the camp, and then also with our own survey data that we tried to construct in the best sort of counterfactual way that we could, which is we surveyed households that were living in Kakuma town. Something that's important to note is that host families, they do not live in the camp, they live outside of the camp. In Kakuma town and around. And then we chose 2 what we call counterfactual towns as our control towns. And the way that we selected these towns is that they had to have a similar population to Kakuma in 1989, so prior to the arrival of refugees. And they were situated on sort of the main artery that connects Kitale, which is a town in southwestern Kenya, to Juba, which is the capital of South Sudan. It's a main artery for the transport of goods, and obviously is going to be important economically. So we picked towns that were about the same size as Kakuma, that were situated on this highway, and then we stratified our random sampling of these households by their distance to the center of the town itself. So here's a map of the Turkana region, and here is Kakuma. That's where the refugee camp is located. Our first counterfactual town is a town called Lokichogio, and actually Lokichogio is also going to be, we're actually going to use it not as a counterfactual, but as a placebo, because Lokichogio is where initially all of the NGO operations for the camp were running. And so we would think that that's obviously an important place. And we can also see if if there's something in particular about just the NGOs being there and creating an economy just through the NGOs, or if it's something specific to actually having refugees, which is what Kakuma has. Our 2 counterfactual towns are Lorugum, which had a similar population to Kakuma in 1989 and is situated on this main artery leading to Uganda, and Lokichar, which again meets the same criteria and is situated on this highway. And interestingly enough, right before in the couple of years before we started collecting the data, Lokichar had discovered oil and was all of a sudden sort of booming economically. So this is also an interesting counterfactual place to study, because it obviously has economic importance, but it doesn't have refugees. So I won't bore you too much with the estimating equation. Economists would obsess over this, but just in general, what we're doing is we're taking as our dependent variable, we have an index of nighttime lights. We take the inverse hyperbolic sine, which is essentially like a log function because there is skew in the data. And we look at, as our independent variables, we interact the population of refugees living in the camp in a particular year, and we interact that with how far away your village is. So we're taking the nighttime lights in a particular village. So how far away is your village from the camp itself? And then we control for lots of other things that vary over time and across space. So we control for the distance to a road, which is obviously going to be very important. We control for village fixed effects and year fixed effects, which allow us to capture unobservable factors that don't change over time. So that's the village fixed effect. And things that macroeconomic factors that change over time with the year fixed effects. And what I'll show you next is a very messy table, but I will walk you through it. In panel A, we parameterize our dependent variable in a few different ways, just to really check how robust our estimates are. And then we also look at various different constraints on the data. So in panel A, we're just using what is the log essentially of the nighttime lights index as the dependent variable. And in the first column, we look at our full sample of villages. In the second column, we restrict the sample to only villages that had a similar population to Kakuma, so 5,000 people or more in 1989. And in the third column, we restrict our villages to only villages that ever registered any positive nighttime light activity ever in history. And what we can see is that, the further away from the camp you get, and as the refugee population increases, the nighttime lights index goes down, or conversely, the closer you get, the higher the nighttime lights index is. And that's what we're doing in columns 4 through 6, is we just look at the inverse of that as a measure of proximity. In panel B and panel C, we do other things to account for the fact that there are lots of zeros in our data. So in panel B, we limit our analysis, we use a Tobit analysis, which allows us to account for the fact that we're truncated at 0. We get very similar results. So the closer you are to the camp and the more refugees there are, the higher the nighttime lights index is. And then in panel C, we just use a linear probability model, which is a 0, 1 for do you have any nighttime lights index at all? And again, very robust results. What I like to show instead of that messy table is this beautiful picture, which basically tells the story in a picture. So first in panel A, what we're looking at is we take bins of 10 kilometers away from the camp, and we look at the average of the nighttime lights in that bin as the refugee population increases. And you can see really this effect is coming from villages that are within 10 kilometers of the camp. So a 10% increase in the refugee population is associated with 3.7% increase in the luminosity index, or a proxy of economic activity. When we look at these counterfactual and placebo towns, so in panel B, we say, okay, let's just assume that the camp was located in Lokichar, and let's see what the effect of the increasing refugee population is. Well, there's no effect, and that's what we would expect, right? And then in panel C, what we're looking at is this placebo of Lokichogio, which is the place where originally all the NGO activity was occurring. And what's fascinating about this is, first of all, you don't see any effect close to Lokichogio, but when we look at the distance bin that's associated with Kakuma, you see the effect for Kakuma. So this, for us, was very reassuring to say, look, there's something going on. So as more refugees come into the camp, economic activity is increasing over time. What we then do is we take our cross-sectional data and we just look at consumption using the HSNP data at distance bins to Kakuma. And again, what we find is that households that are living within 10 kilometers of the camp, their consumption is 25% higher than these other households that are living farther away from the camp. So these two estimates allow us to essentially do a back of the envelope calculation and let us know what is the elasticity of consumption with respect to refugee inflows. And that's about 0.55, which is pretty high. With a 10% increase in the refugee population. We look at other mechanisms. I won't go into the estimation, but we look at, what are the mechanisms that are potentially driving this result? And it appears that there are two main mechanisms. The first is through the labor market. So for households that live near to the camp, there's more employment in low-skilled occupations. So remember, at the time of the establishment of the refugee camp, there essentially was no labor market for Turkana people. They were just herding cattle, essentially. Now, presently, there are people who are living near the camp, working for UNHCR in low-skilled occupations as cleaners, as cooks, as drivers, as, greeting officers when people come into the camp. The other main channel that we find is through the livestock market. So, and this is pretty intuitive when you think about it. So refugees get, a food aid package from the WFP, the World Food Program, and that consists of flour, oil, beans, and rice, essentially. But there's no meat. And most of these cultures eat meat. And what do the Turkana have? They have meat. So there's an exchange between Turkana producers who can sell their meat in the main livestock market in Kakuma and refugee households who are able to buy this meat. And so what we find is that the livestock prices closer to the camp are rising with the influx of refugees. And so, the takeaways from this first paper really is that there's considerable economic links between the refugee and the host community in this context. And at least in this context, which is one of the largest camps in the world, refugee camps do generate some positive benefits for the local economy. And, there's obviously caveats. We look at a particular camp in a rural area. This is not representative of all camps, but I would say representative of many camps. But obviously the effects are going to be different in other settings. I can't say anything about what are these effects going to be in the US or in Europe or in Australia. Furthermore, our counterfactual is not perfect. We did the best that we could with the data that we had, but it's not perfect. So I'm not necessarily claiming that it's causal, but it's highly, highly suggestive. And what we are observing here are average effects. So we don't look at any heterogeneity. We can't do a cost benefit analysis and say, the benefit of hosting refugees will be this much in GDP. We can't say that. But what we can say is that, there's a strong link between the host and the refugee community that benefits both. So what we do in the second paper is we exploit this natural experiment that happened right as we were just getting ready to collect the data for the first paper. There was, I don't know if any of you remember this, but there was a terrorist attack on Garissa University College, which is in the northeast of Kenya, in April 2015, and Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility for that attack where, over 100 people died and many people were injured. The Kenyan government was obviously distressed and as a result, expressed concern about the lack of oversight of money sending agencies, specifically what they were calling Muslim transfers, through a transfer system known as Hawala. So I'll get into the details of Hawala in a minute, but it's essentially it's a money exchange rooted in Islamic finance. And mostly limited, people who are using Hawala are mostly Muslim. So the Kenyan government says, all right, nope, we're shutting down Hawala because this is funding terrorist activities. And so the central bank shut down all Hawala transfers starting on April 8th, 2015, and reopened them again in June of 2015. So we were already collecting our data. We started to collect our data in early June. So we're able to, we ask households retrospectively, what was your consumption before April? And then, what is your consumption now? And we're able to try and understand how this shock to remittances may have affected not only refugee households, but Turkana households as well. So how does Hawala work? Hawala is an informal way of transferring money between two people. So essentially, you're person A and you say, I want to send money to person B. And I'm going to do that by going to my Hawala dealer, person X. And you say, okay, I want to send my friend some money. And the dealer says, okay, great. How much do you want to send them? And what is the password that they need to give to pick up the money? So you give them that information. The Hawala dealer then goes to their friend, Hawala dealer M, who's nearby to your friend, and says, okay, they're sending the money. Here's the money. They don't actually exchange. So the dealers don't necessarily exchange money directly right away. This is an informal transfer system based on the honor system. So at some point, these people, these dealers will settle up, but there isn't necessarily an actual exchange of money at the time. So it's really based on the honor system and trust. And there's no interest. There's no fees. The fees are very low because it follows Islamic financial principles. So then the dealer says, all right, great, I have the information. Your friend comes in to pick up the money. They give the password, they get the money. And that's how Hawala works. In spite of its informalness, there are, formal businesses. So this is a picture of the Habshil, which is the largest Hawala dealer in Kenya, certainly. So, it is formalized institutionally, but it's really based on the honor system, and the fees are really low. So the government of Kenya says, all right, no Hawala transfers. However, things like Western Union and other forms of mobile money transfers were still able to function over this time. So when we think about how this shutdown could impact first refugees, obviously there would be direct negative effects on households who are previously using remittances. But there could be positive externalities or positive, spillover effects on other households if the decrease in purchasing from the households who are affected lower prices. So if you have a decrease in demand from the households who can no longer buy what they were buying, this will push prices down. And if you weren't affected, this is positive for you because you can buy things for cheaper. But if you're a household that is selling those goods, you will be hurt by those lower prices. So again, the effects are kind of ambiguous, or at least, heterogeneous. And so we'll try to look at this heterogeneity in our analysis. When you think about Turkana households or host households, there will be, just like producers, refugee producers or refugee goods sellers, there would be negative effects on households who are selling items to refugees if the demand for those items falls as a result of their reduction in income. But again, if you're a household who's consuming these goods that have the price lowered, then you benefit from having a lower price of consumption. Or there could just be no effect on households if you're uninvolved in markets at all. And some Turkana households are not involved in markets, although, as we established in the first paper, the ones that live around the camp certainly are involved in markets. So to look at this, we interviewed Hawala dealers. So there are Hawala dealers inside of the camp that we were able to interview and get some qualitative information from. And then we also have the 2 household surveys that we were conducting right at the time of the shutdown. So we have the refugee household survey, which we conducted from June 9th to the 20th. So the ban was lifted on the 22nd. So all of the refugees in our household, we interviewed while they were currently unable to access Hawala. The Turkana household was roughly the same time. We have a few households that were, that we interviewed after the ban was lifted. But we asked a lot of different information in the household on their demographics, on their employment. We had a consumption schedule. So that's largely what we'll use to understand, what are the impacts. And we asked households, what was your consumption like in the first week of April versus at the time of the survey? So obviously a caveat is that, the pre-data we have is retrospective. But nonetheless, we do our best. So when we interviewed these Hawala dealers, they tell us that the remittance shutdown was complete. It was enforced. They could not make any transfers. When we talked to them about what their transfers were like prior to the shutdown, they were enormous. So the average monthly transfers for the Habshil was about $60,000 USD. When we look across these 5 dealers in the camp, what they report suggests that there's 2.4 million USD in transfers occurring annually. This is enormous. And this, there are other researchers who prior to the shutdown have been doing work on Hawala in the camp, and this data is completely consistent with what they have collected as well. So, this is an enormous amount of economic activity that's occurring, and that was stopped for a couple of months. When we interviewed refugees, what we found is that 60% of refugees had received remittances in the past year. The average size of the last transfer was about $200, and they receive around 6 transfers per year. So again, this is a lot of economic activity coming into the camp. When you compare that to the GDP per capita in Kenya, which was around $1,500 USD in 2016, this is significant. 54% of remittances occur through Hawala. This is largely due to the fact that there's a huge Somali population in the camp who are Muslim, and there are other smaller populations as well. But this is also, as a researcher, this was nice for us because we have variation. So not everyone is receiving hawala. Some people are receiving hawala, and we can exploit that heterogeneity to really try and understand the various channels. 45% of the remittance receivers who we interviewed, they reported that they experienced a decrease in remittances since the shutdown. So when we just look before and after, we just compare everyone in our refugee sample, so 170 households, we compare their consumption in April to their consumption in June with a simple t-test. We don't find any differences. So there was no change on average. But as I mentioned, there's significant heterogeneity in this population. And so if the first level of heterogeneity we look at is just, do you receive transfers or do you not receive transfers? And you can see, regardless of whether it's hawala, so you can see that, people whose languages, we didn't ask people what is your religion, but we know the language that the interview was conducted in, and people from Somalia, Nuba, and Darfur are mostly Muslim, and so we use that as our proxy, sort of, for how exposed to hawala would you be, and so people who, we think would be most likely to use hawala and who had received transfers previously, there's a big difference in their consumption before and after. And people who've been in the camp longer were more affected, had a lower consumption. I'm sorry, their transfers were affected. But they actually, their transfers were affected, sorry. And people who have household enterprises were affected. So these are the business owners who are probably using remittances to fund their businesses. And again, people whose income was largely, a larger share of their income was coming from businesses as opposed to being employed or to selling animals, they also were affected by the shutdown. Again, these are just simple comparisons of needs. So then we look again at those who used hawala specifically, and it's a similar pattern, right? So people who are more likely to use hawala were impacted. People who said their transfers, people who use hawala were more likely to say that their transfers had decreased since April. They are less likely to be selling animals. So this is consistent with what we would think of, the characteristics of people who would be impacted by the shutdown. Then we try to estimate, the effect of this shutdown on consumption for users and, users compared to non-users before and after the shock. So this is empirically something, similar to what we'd call a difference in differences. The only caveat is that, we don't have a whole panel of pre-data. We're really just looking at these two periods, one of which was a retrospective survey, but nonetheless, could be informative. So what we look at is your consumption in April and in June, and we regress that on, a dummy for whether this was the June period that you reported, and then we interact that with sources of heterogeneity. So did you use hawala in the past? Were you interviewed in a language that, is associated with Islam? Do you earn wages primarily? Do you own a business? And then we include a household fixed effect to control for unobservable factors about the household that don't change over time. And what do we find? So the first thing we find is that for households who received hawala in the past, when we look at their consumption in June compared to their consumption in April, what we find is there's a decrease in some pretty key pretty key goods, which include milk and meat, which also happen to come from things like cows and goats and sheep that, they're not producing, the Turkana households are producing. So already we sort of anticipate this might have a spillover effect onto the local community. And this decrease in consumption is pretty large. So it's a 26 to 33% decrease in the consumption of these goods for households that use Hawala. When we look at households who don't receive Hawala, that's what this coefficient captures, is that there's actually an increase in the consumption of these. And these would be considered luxury goods. So things like sugar, milk, and meat, they don't come in the aid package. They're not things that people eat every day normally, they are more expensive. And so when you look at households who didn't receive Hawala and you look at their consumption in June compared to their consumption in April, we see an increase in the consumption of these luxury goods. So this suggests there must have been some kind of price impact on these goods. If you can increase your consumption of them, they're probably cheaper. And that would be driven by the fact that the Hawala households have reduced their demand for these goods. We run the same estimation, just looking at a different measure of Hawala exposure. So instead of the direct question, do you use Hawala? We just look at what language was the interview conducted in. And we find a very similar effect here. So households that speak Somali, Nuba, or Darfuri have reduced their consumption of milk and meat in June compared to April. And we do still see, at least a positive increase for sugar in these other households. Then we look at more, heterogeneous impacts by the income source. So were you a wage worker? Did you own your own business? And again, we still use the interaction of Hawala. So again, we still see this reduction in consumption for Hawala households, but we don't really see an impact on wage workers or people who own businesses. So then we look at the Turkana households. So we have reason to believe there could be, especially, with the reduction of meat and milk, there could be spillover effects onto the Turkana households, particularly if they're producing these things, if they're selling these goods to the refugees. And so we leverage again our empirical strategy where we're looking at households that are close to the camp and far away from the camp using those counterfactual towns I had told you about before. And we're looking at their change in consumption between April and June, depending on whether they live in the Kakuma sample or if they are farther outside of the Kakuma sample. And then we also look at their heterogeneity by their income source. Are they producing livestock, or are they doing other things? Are they more exposed to this shock or not? And what we find is that, in terms of things that we think would, confound this analysis, their income and assets between households who live in Kakuma versus don't live in Kakuma are basically the same. So in terms of wealth, on average, these households are the same. So we would be concerned, right, if, for example, households living near Kakuma were just poorer on average. That would suggest that if we did find any effect, it's just because these households are poor. We don't have reason to believe that would be poor. In fact, we think they would be richer because they're so linked into this economy. But, on average, we find that they're basically the same. But what we do find is if we look at their consumption in June, it's much lower for the households that are living near Kakuma. And we do find that they've decreased their food consumption. They're more likely to have decreased their food consumption over time between April and June. So then we estimate more formally this impact, and what we just look at a simple regression is, what was the change in your purchase of sugar and tea and milk, these, more luxury goods, if you're in the Kakuma sample, your consumption decreased for sugar and tea. This is just if you purchased it on the, intensive margin. It doesn't seem like there's any effect, but whether, external margin, did you purchase or did you not purchase, you're much less likely to purchase these things if you're living in Kakuma. And then we look at the heterogeneity by, how exposed to this shock would you be? Well, if you're selling animals, you're going to be more exposed to this shock because we already demonstrated that the demand for these goods decreased. And in fact, we find that this is really driven by, households who are selling animals. And the probability of consumption has decreased by, 12 and 15% for sugar and tea, respectively. So what we find here is that on average, refugees are not hurt by the shutdown. But, the more exposed you were to this shock, not surprisingly, the bigger the effect. So Hawala receiving refugees, they reduced their consumption of key goods as a result of this shock from 23 to 29%, including meat, which, they buy from the Turkana households. Other groups were not as affected by this shock. And if anything, non-Hawala households were positively affected by this shock through the reduction in price of these goods. We find spillover effects to Turkana households, particularly those who are producing meat and milk, and these goods that Hawala households reduce their consumption of. And so that results in a reduction of, the purchase of key luxury goods, sugar and tea by the Turkana households. And so, I think the main takeaway from this paper is that things like, blunt policies like blockages to remittances, they can have a really negative effect, especially on the populations they weren't intended to impact. And so we need to be thoughtful about how we approach these kinds of policies. So that's all I have for you today. I'm a little bit early, but I hope that we can have a nice discussion. This is just a picture that I took of a Turkana household outside of Kakuma, and it's pretty representative of their way of life. And yeah, so I hope that you learned something, and I look forward to our discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for this really engaging presentation. So for those of you in the audience, please feel free to use the raised hand feature if you have any specific questions, or use the chat. I'll exercise my privilege of going first to ask. So, especially given that this is, kind of a more established project and one that you're sort of, have kind of closed the book on, I wanted to ask you, in particular for some of the students in the audience, to reflect a little bit on the experience of doing this research project. So a few things that are obviously striking. This is a very challenging area to do research in for a number of reasons. So if you could talk a little bit about your field work and some of that. One thing that's really striking and really lovely, I think, about the research in the presentation is, you're very forthcoming about some of the shortcomings, but you do a lot of creative things, I think, to get some empirical leverage in places that I think would be really hard to get, like that perfect identification strategy. So I'd also love to hear a little bit about your thought process, how you kind of develop those things.
Yeah, thanks for that, Emily. Yeah, first I'll speak about the fieldwork. So, I've done a lot of fieldwork in my life, and this certainly was not the first fieldwork that I had ever done, but to this day remains the most challenging fieldwork I've ever done. First of all, just the environmental conditions are very tough. So we were there in, May, June, July, and August, which are some of the hottest months. It's very arid. It's very dusty. It was just physically and I wasn't even conducting interviews. I was just managing a field team and going out, for a couple hours to check on people and then debriefing at the lovely Ethiopian restaurant. And that in itself was the most challenging work I've ever done, environmentally, but also just it's a difficult region politically in terms of security. So at the time, we had to travel with armed guards everywhere we went. So I guess I should take an even bigger step back and say this work would not have been possible if it were not for the support of the World Bank and UNHCR. So essentially the way we came into, we didn't just rock up to the camp and say, hey, we want to do some interviews. This kind of work requires a lot of institutional support. So we were invited by the World Bank and the UNHCR to conduct this study. And the first paper resulted in a policy paper that the World Bank has published, and it informed policy in Kenya about what they were going to do with the camps. So to do this kind of field work, speaking to the students in the room, to do this kind of field work requires a very strong institutional partner and support, because otherwise it's not possible, but it's also not appropriate, right? So I think, there was a lot of conversation between UNHCR and the World Bank and local Turkana leaders. So the very first thing that we did when we arrived in Turkana, even though we had the support of UNHCR and the World Bank, we went to each of these, counterfactual towns, and we met with the political leaders of those towns, introduced ourselves and said, here's what we're doing, here's who we're working with. Do we have your support to work in your community? And that, those were long conversations, and, is the first step you have to do when you conduct this kind of field work. And thankfully we got the support, but yeah, it was intense. It was intense. And anytime we traveled to these other towns, we really were accompanied by armed guards, and that, I had never experienced anything like that prior, and I haven't since. So yeah, it was hard. And then in terms of, the empirical strategy, I have one foot in the development economics world. And I think, as many of you know, that's the world of RCTs. And, I've certainly done RCTs, and they're appropriate for certain questions, but this is very clearly something that you can't randomize. And, not everything can or should be answered with an RCT. And so I think, what we said to ourselves is like, how could we possibly piece together enough evidence that would be, highly suggestive of something? So that's why we said, all right, obviously we can do things cross-sectionally. And so let's think about empirically, what are the types of things that can confound any kind of analysis, unobservable or observable. And that's sort of how we came up with the counterfactual towns in our cross-sectional analysis. And then we said, okay, how could we, essentially what we're trying to answer is a long-term question, but we only have a snapshot of data. So how could we possibly, get data that would allow us to look at these longer-term effects, which, if you haven't worked with the nighttime lights data, I would encourage you to look into it. It's a really phenomenal set of data, and allows you to answer questions, even in very remote parts of the world. So yeah, I think we're living in a fortunate time of data where there's just all of this data that has become available to us. And, that's both good and bad. You have to be smart and intentional with how you use the data. But I hope that I've convinced you that we were.
Yeah, great. Are there other questions? I have a few more if we, so if no one else has a question, I guess one thing I wanted to invite Sarah to do is talk about some of her current work. I know that it's kind of evolved in sort of an econ history-ish direction, but also relating to migration, and also relating to, I think, some of these really important questions related to culture, institutions, history, that kind of actually get raised a little bit, especially in this sort of longer term analysis that you do in this in this first paper. So I'd be curious to know if you see any sort of through line with this earlier work to your current work, or you think of it as more of a departure, but it'd be great to hear about some of your current projects as well.
Yeah, I would love to talk about my current projects. I'm super excited about them. I do see, I see them. So to back up, what Emily's referring to is, at the moment, I'm working on a large project that was funded by the Australian Research Council to understand the dynamics of racial violence in the United States going back to before the Civil War all the way up until today. And obviously migration is a part of that. I'm not looking directly at migration at the moment, but certainly conflict is at the root of that project. And I do see these two as being related, certainly through the long-term impacts that conflict can have on a society and the protracted situations that it creates. And so what I'm doing in that paper is essentially trying to understand, how did the Civil War contribute to protracted racial violence in the United States? And so, we Americans love to talk about the Civil War and how it was the bloodiest war in all of our wars combined. And, it was obviously a pivotal moment for race relations in the United States. It, ended the institution of slavery. And at least in the very early years following, during Reconstruction, ushered in an era of progressive civil rights that were mainly granted to Black men. What I do in the paper essentially is look at how did the casualties that were sustained in the Civil War. So it was only in the South, only white men fought in the Confederacy. And, nearly 25% of the young male population, white male population, died fighting in the Civil War. And that had a significant demographic effect on the population. So not only do you have a shift in the balance of racial power, now there's relatively more Black men than white men who now have political rights and economic rights that are, for some white Southerners perceived as a threat to the social order. But there's also a shift in gendered power because you have all these young white men who are dying. And now there's what we would call, in gross econ speak, we would say there's a surplus of white women, or there's this disruption to what we would call the white marriage market. So there's a generation of young white women who are unmarried. They're either widowed or they can't find partners who are their age because they have died in the war. And so essentially what I'm looking at is the intersection of these two forms of power. So you have a shift in racial power and you have a shift in gendered power. And that creates a perfect storm of racism and violence. And what we're finding in this paper is that, not only is there an increase in racial violence in places where the white male death rate was higher, but there's a particular type of violence. So, lynchings were, the main form of violence used against Black people for, 100+ years. But in particular, in about 40% of lynchings, when you look at the data, the excuse given for the lynching was that a Black man had sexually assaulted a white woman. And we know Ida B. Wells was working on this in the 1890s. We know that these are false accusations. And she has a really famous quote saying that, if you look at 4/5 of these accusations, they would be considered adultery. And so what she's insinuating is that actually these are consensual relationships that were happening between white women and Black men. And, because they were taboo and bucked the norms of the social order, they were often called rape. And, someone's father finds out that his daughter is having an illicit relationship and tells her to claim that she's been raped. And, this justifies the lynchings. And in fact, To Kill a Mockingbird is all about this. So, this is an enduring phenomenon in our culture. And, what our work is essentially showing is that in these places where more white men died in the Civil War, you see an increase in racial violence, but it's primarily through this sexual channel. So you only see more lynchings using sexual excuses. You don't see more lynchings for murder or assault or arson or theft. It's only using the sexual excuse. And then we combine that with data from the newspapers that we scraped keywords from newspapers, which were highly localized at the time. And what we find is there's a narrative in the places where more white deaths happened in the Civil War. There's a narrative in the newspapers that, Black men are rapists, essentially. And we see this, not only, we actually don't see this during Reconstruction. So we have a very long-term set of data. We're looking from 1850 all the way up until today. And, you don't see this narrative happening during Reconstruction when the South was occupied by federal troops. But as soon as Reconstruction ends, and as soon as the Democrats, which were not the Progressive Party at the time, are able to run again for office, you see more support for the Democratic Party. And you also see the votes shift Republican in the late 50s and 60s when the parties shifted their policies toward race. You see this narrative being used in the newspapers that's consistent all the way up until 1930, which is where our data ends for that. And then when you look at the implicit association test, which I don't know how familiar any of you guys are with this, but it's a test that Harvard does online. You should take it. And it gives you pictures of Black and white faces and good and bad words, and you associate these words with faces. We find actually no effect on implicit bias, but when you look at the self-reported questions that respondents are asked at the end of the survey, there is an association today among respondents who are living in a place that had a big shock during the Civil War and their racial attitudes. And they're largely ones that are consistent with this narrative. So they're more likely to think that Black people are violent. They're less likely to want to have a sexual relationship with a Black person. They're less likely to want to have a Black roommate. They feel nervous and uncomfortable around Black people. So yeah, this is still a work in progress. And we have a working paper that's up on my website if you'd like to read it. We're in the process of revising it, but yeah, it's, an obvious tragic finding, but I think it's an important one for us to share. And we're excited to be able to share that.
Absolutely. I will definitely check it out. And I think strangely, it kind of is a connection with this sort of legacies of conflict, legacies of violence literature.
Yeah.
Yes. Any other questions? Well, in that case, let me thank again, Sarah, especially, for being so flexible at the time so we can all make it. A large number of students I know are also going to watch this on recording. So I also like to thank you for, in addition to this great presentation, to being so candid about sort of the experience of working in this topic. I think it's really extraordinarily valuable for people to hear. We're looking forward to seeing how this new research agenda develops.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. And thank you so much to the center for having me. This has really been wonderful. And please, for those of you who are watching the recorded version or even watching now, really feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to talk about my research and would love to hear from you.
Thank you very much. A pleasure to have you here.